everybody. Really glad to be with you this week, although very saddened in my heart, as I'm sure all of you are, about the shootings that happened in the Danzig neighborhood in Scarborough the other night. Everybody's talking about that. Everybody's talking about solutions, wondering what we can do as a community and what institutions can do to help prevent this kind of violence. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. I am not an expert in any way, and I don't want to claim to be an expert, but I do have some thoughts about, I guess, the contradictory messages we send in this country to young people, particularly racialized young people, and people who live in neighborhoods where that are dominated with low-income households and people who are new to the country. And I think we send some really mixed messages, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I wanted to link what is happening in Toronto, very public shootings, very different, certainly causing justifiably lots and lots of concern among people. I know making people more nervous and worried about attending public events and events where there's going to be crowds of people. Certainly I think lots of us will be concerned about heavy-handed police responses to this violence. Obviously we need some kind of response, but what we seem to do in Toronto very often is come back with the wrong kinds of responses, and indeed not just in Toronto but in Canada. And so certainly with Caribana coming up, we've already seen in past events, Caribana events, very heavy police presences. Lots of people concerned about that, concerned about what they perceive to be and what often is a targeting of racialized people by police attention. I was at a forum actually last night that the Toronto Police Accountability Coalition hosted at the 519 that was well attended, where we talked about the issue of racial profiling and the use of contact cards. These are called 208 cards, where police randomly stop and question, often, most often, as shown in Toronto Star research, most often racialized youth, target them for questioning, search their backpacks, that kind of thing, and the distrust that practice creates between communities of racialized young people and the police. And those kinds of practices actually tear down and undermine the very relationships that the police say they want to build with communities. Racial profiling and practices of stop and chats and TAVIS, flooding of neighborhoods, are the standard police response to things, to incidents like what happened in Danzig and what happened down at the Eaton Centre. And interestingly enough, not the kind of response we see to the shooting that happened on College Street at College in Crawford during the World Cup. In any case, we see that often in racialized communities, a response by police very heavy-handed. Increased use of TAVIS, the Toronto Anti-Violence Intervention Strategy, increased stop and chats, pleas by the police for young people and other people who are witnesses to these things to step forward and talk with them. And of course the police do need the cooperation of communities when it comes to these kinds of incidents. They do need people to step up and to say, you know, I saw what happened, these are the people involved. But understandably, people are very, very worried about retaliatory violence. They're very, very worried about talking with the police and being drawn into being criminalized themselves, having those conversations show up later on a reference check, suddenly being swept into the net that is called known to police. And people worry about that. They worry about being seen as snitches. They worry about the fact that clearly police and communities cannot protect people from violence. Increasing police presence, contrary to kind of popular belief, does not make a neighborhood safer. What it does is it moves crime into places where police aren't. And unless we want as a community to have police officers patrolling every single neighborhood 24/7 and involved with our neighborhoods in lots of different ways, in blanketing kind of ways, and I don't think people want that, but unless we want that, increased police presence obviously is not going to make a difference, and people know that, and they know that talking with the police is a dangerous act in some places. So we've got to figure out different ways to respond. And we've got to see the connections between some of the decisions taken by our federal, provincial, and local governments in the recent past and what is happening on the streets of Toronto, and in fact in many places in Toronto. While we need to be concerned, of course, about the violence that happens in public, we know that in Toronto and in cities right across this country, in towns across this country, violence is happening in people's homes, and women are dealing primarily with that violence. And we need to remember that public violence is the tip of an iceberg, and that we live in a culture and in a society that still has notions and describes masculinity and celebrates masculinity that is dominant, that is overpowering, that uses intimidation and dominance to have its own way, to rule over women, to rule over children, to intimidate other men who are perceived as weaker. And that is still the role modeling that lots of our young men get. Our young men also get role modeling that says that gun culture is in fact celebrated in this society. All you have to do is play video games, go to the movies, watch television, look at movie posters plastered all over the city, and we can see that gun culture is pervasive in our society. That shoot 'em ups and spraying bullets in public places is in fact something I'll go to the Avengers and watch. I'll go to Superman and watch. I'll go to Batman movies and watch. I'll play on my video games. I'll see on a television show like 24 or some other television show that is all about guns and gangs and police culture and that kind of thing. So we send a lot of contradictory messages that way. I'm not suggesting to censor popular culture or to use censorship, but I am saying that we need to make the connections between what our kids view every day on the streetcar, in public bus stops, in advertising, in movies, and see that culture is glorified. And so when it isn't glorified is when it happens in real life. And it would be helpful, I think, for us to make the connections between our constructions of masculinity in this culture, fond as we are of saying that, sexist masculinity exists in other countries, not here in Canada. That's absolutely not true. We also need to make the connections between the public violence that is experienced in this city and the private violence that is experienced in homes across this city. We need to make connections between that public violence and the violence that is experienced by Aboriginal women, by hundreds and thousands of Aboriginal women in this country. So it's important for us to understand that violence is violence is violence, and that we need to be taking action against all forms of violence. The other thing we need to make connections about is the actions of our government to, in fact, celebrate gun culture. Our federal government refuses to make gun owners register their firearms and seems to be cavalier about the fact that many, many homes across this country are harboring guns that are stolen and get out onto the street, guns that are used in domestic violence, in rural and urban neighborhoods, guns that are kept for sport, but that are not stored properly, and that kind of thing. We have local governments and provincial governments that refuse to issue handgun bans and refuse to issue bullet bans. And so we see that while everyone will decry the gun violence, very few governments are willing to take tough steps that are needed that might lose them some votes, frankly, and that is usually what governs government thinking, and we need to get past that. We need to look at measures that will be good for our communities even if they're not popular, and banning handguns and banning bullets is certainly, and registering firearms is certainly an easy thing that we can do. That will it stop the flow of guns into the country? No, but it certainly will stop a flow of guns. We also need our federal government to take seriously the smuggling of illegal guns into this country and to take the steps that are required. We need our governments, the provincial government, to understand that the actions they've taken recently in the provincial budget to cut the community startup grants that helps poor families with moving costs and first and last month's rent, and getting independence after living in shelters and that kind of thing. Cutting those benefits, delaying the child benefit, the increase to the child benefit as the government has done, refusing to increase minimum wage, income supports through OW and ODSP to levels that people can live on. People in marginalized communities and marginalized neighborhoods know that our governments are not willing to put their money where their mouth is when it comes to bringing all of the members of our communities into the fold and bringing them into the family that we say that we have. And kids from those communities know that their parents are struggling. They know that the police are hassling them through racial profiling. They know that and believe that our larger community doesn't care about them. And when people get cut off from their community, when they think that they have no future, when they think that they have nothing to gain, we also can see that they cannot identify and stop identifying with the people that they start that at street parties and in their communities, and that's also where violence can happen. And there's lots more that we could say on this, and we'll come back to it for sure. I'm going to keep informing you about resistance to government agendas and police agendas of profiling, resistance to cutting benefits, programs to priority neighborhoods, funding for programs, funding for individuals. We'll keep talking about that, and we'll keep looking at the complexity of this issue. There are no quick answers to the violence that's happening in our community, and we've got to talk with the kids that are in these communities. We've got to talk to the youth that are taking up guns. We need to go to them. They are the experts on why this is happening, and we need to talk to them. Unfortunately, our premier is going to talk to the chief of the police and mayor. We already know what they're going to say. It's not going to be effective. We need to have a different conversation and be talking to the people we haven't talked to yet, and that's where we'll find our solutions.